Do you have trouble understanding what fertilizer to apply to your landscape? Hey, we're going to discuss understanding fertilizers on this edition of the DIY Pest Control Podcast. Welcome to the DIY Pest Control Podcast, where you get the best info for those who want to perform their own pest control. The DIY Pest Control Podcast is brought to you by Nature Pest. Nature Pest has been providing the finest in commercial and residential integrated pest management for structural, lawns, trees, shrubs, and mosquitoes with better control and less contamination at an affordable price. For more info, visit us at naturepest.com. Hey, welcome back. Welcome to this edition of the DIY Pest Control Podcast. I am Frank Hernandez, your host, and we're going to be discussing understanding fertilizers. And a lot of people get very frustrated, or they don't know what's going on when they're applying a fertilizer and it's not working and their plants are still looking bad, and why it is that this is happening. And let's take a look at what most people experience with fertilizers. And that is, they go down to their big box hardware store and they look at the fertilizer section. And if they want to fertilize their palm trees, they look at a fertilizer that says palm fertilizer, but there's two bags there. One says an 8-10-10, a 13-3-13, or a 12-4-12. And which one do you apply? And so they look at this as, well, it's for palm trees, and they all say for palm trees. So you make the worst mistake of your life. You call over the clerk in the store, which he's, probably like 16 years old, and you ask him what's the difference, and he regurgitates back to you the label that's in the front. And you got to understand that all the information on pesticides, whether it's a fertilizer, it's a pesticide, it's a herbicide, an insecticide, a fungicide, it doesn't really matter. What's on the front of that label is irrelevant. It is marketing. And what you need to look at is the label itself and understand it and what's there. And the label is going to be really on the back. And on the back of any fertilizer bag is what is known as the guaranteed analysis. This is what's in the bag and what you're getting. And in the case of palm trees need a lot of micronutrients. Those are those metals like magnesium, manganese, zinc, copper, boron. Those are things that it needs, but it needs in minute quantities. The problem is it's not found usually in the soil. So you have to give it to it artificially. And it all depends how it's derived, whether it's soluble or it's chelated. And it's going to depend how you apply it. So to understand a fertilizer label, it's three main ingredients, which is the first number is your nitrogen. That's the amount of nitrogen. How many pounds of nitrogen is in that bag? Okay, so if it says 8-10-10, then you have 8% nitrogen, or 8 pounds per every 100 pounds that's in that bag. Eight of those pounds is nitrogen. Now, it gets a little confusing if you have a 50-pound bag, because you really only have 4 pounds of nitrogen in that bag, in the entire bag. Okay, and it's the percentage of the components that are in there. So if you have the second number is your phosphorus, and that's going to be depending on whether you have it available in your soil or not. Whether it's in South Florida, we have a ton of it in our soil. We need very little. So a 12-4-12, which is has less phosphorus in it, would be a more appropriate product to use in South Florida. But maybe you're in a northern part of further north, and maybe you're in northern part of Texas, and you don't have any phosphorus in your soil, so you need to add it in. The last number, which is what a lot of palm trees need, is 12. That, let's say that 12, that or the 10 in your label, where if you have a 12-4-12, that last number is your potassium. And palm trees and a lot of plants need more potassium than they need nitrogen, except for lawns. And the reasoning is it helps in cell development. It helps in the building of nice, strong roots. So potassium is very important. Also, palm trees, they can be yellow from potassium deficiency. As a matter of fact, most palm trees are deficient from either potassium or micronutrients. They're not deficient a lot in phosphorus and in nitrogen. Actually, palm trees need very, very little nitrogen. So you have to know what species you're treating and what's the major deficiency. If you have a bag of 12-4-12, but your palm tree needs boron, and it doesn't have boron in the bag, you're getting all those crinkly leaves on your palm trees. Well, that's because there's no boron and no boron in the bag. And you could be putting a whole bag of fertilizer and those leaves are still going to get crinkly because it's missing that micronutrient. Okay, so that's one of the challenges, is for you to understand what's needed by the plant. So when you're installing a plant or you're buying a plant, you can find from the USDA, you can find from your local university, you can find information about that plant and what the deficiencies are, what the pest problems are, what are things that are going on in that plant that you're going to need to know. But getting a good fertilizer that's, usually in that 12 range, with the same number in the front as the same number in the back, and then a combination of micronutrients, is what most plants will need to survive. So if you're buying a 616, understand that a 616 has half the nitrogen, half the potassium of a 12-4-12. And the micronutrients might not be the same. Micronutrients are needed by plants in, like I said, very minute quantities. They're very little that it needs, but it needs to be there. So macronutrients are that nitrogen, the phosphorus, the potassium. Those are your first three numbers. And then all the other little numbers are going to be whatever's needed. Secondary nutrients like calcium, magnesium, sulfur. Those are needed in the plant for cell growth in the plant. Boron, chlorine, copper, iron, manganese, molybdenum, zinc. They're essential in the plants. They need these to survive. And you need to know what is available. Now, what I recommend is that you go to your local store. You can find it in your local store. They usually know what to bring in. Or you go to your local garden center or grower and ask them, you have this plant, what does it need? Especially if you go to a nursery. They're very educated on what they sell and the plants that they sell. And they'll tell you what good fertilizer it is to buy. And then how much and how often it needs to be applied. So the confusion in what fertilizer apply really is going to be dependent upon what plant you have. Second, plants also have some plants like ixoras have micronutrient deficiencies here and stuff like that. And sometimes a ground fertilizer isn't enough. You need to supplement that with a liquid spray of micronutrients. So a liquid fertilizer might be in order on a monthly or a bi-monthly basis, and then a ground fertilizer on a quarterly, every 3 to 4 months would be suffice. For palm trees and things like that, we recommend about every 3 to 4 months, in-ground fertilizer with enough of the micronutrients that it needs to be able to survive. So this gives you a little crash course into fertilizers and what to look for, and always look at the back of the label. See what's included, what's needed. If your plant needs manganese and manganese is not on the label, well, you shouldn't buy that product. You shouldn't apply it because it's not going to do any good. And also get a slow release fertilizer, because slow release fertilizer, at least 50% slow release, meaning that half of the nitrogen is going to be released very quickly. The other half of the nitrogen is going to be released over time. Whether they use a sulfur-coated urea or a poly-coated urea, it doesn't matter. It's just going to depend that it is a slow release nitrogen product, especially in South Florida and in other parts of Florida where you have concerns about nitrogen into the ground and into the groundwater. So we need to protect that groundwater, and that's why it's very important that you only apply the fertilizers that are needed and nothing more. If your plant doesn't need a fertilizer, it does well, it adapts well, then don't apply one. If you feel that it needs it because there's some deficiency issue, whether it's they're chlorotic, they're not green, they're yellowish. Those could be secondary micronutrient issues. So we thank you. We thank you for listening to the podcast. Just keep listening and keep growing and keep understanding. And we will see you in the next episode. Thank you for listening to the DIY Pest Control Podcast. Please remember that although Franklin Hernandez is a certified and licensed pest control operator in the state of Florida, the content of this podcast is for informational purposes only. You should consult your local and state government or cooperative extension service before performing any pest control service. Remember to always read and follow label directions because the label is the law.